Since the 1930s, the sci-fi dream of being able to freeze yourself and return back years in the future has been in the minds of many.
The possibility of life after death is explored in Phoenix, Arizona by the Cryonic Society.
From Austin Power to Space Odyssey, the topic of cryonics has never really left the sci-fi sphere.
The cold, only a few miles out in space, will be far more intense than in the polar regions, and its power of preserving the dead body.
Well, you'll be surprised to know that since the 1970s, several organizations have tried to make this dream a reality. Some more successful than others. In an age where robots make your cars and you can leave your girlfriend for an AI waifu, how does death fit in? That and more on today's episode on A Show About Stuff. Have you ever wondered what it would like to be immortal? Chances are you probably have. According to National Geographic, children start to grasp the concept of mortality around 4. It's a reflex built within ourselves and is one of the greatest contributors to mankind's unique place in nature.
It's built within our limbic system to fear death. As our ancient ancestors sort of evolved and started to develop the cerebral cortex to the point where they could understand, think about reality in terms of past, present, and future, and become self-aware and realize that they are creatures themselves in the world. That awareness and those capabilities allowed us to first realize that the only inevitable thing in the future is our own death and that of everyone else. And our speculation, based on a lot of our anthropological, archaeological evidence, is that this was an unacceptable realization that couldn't be fully accepted, and so to try and cope with that fact, early societies developed belief systems that would help deny that death is the end of existence. And so all traditional cultures believe in some form of continuance through an immortal soul, through an afterlife, through reincarnation, etc. I mean, ancient burial rituals go back at least 50,000 years, probably longer, and they suggest belief in an afterlife. The oldest architectural great architectural feats, had to do with serving spiritual purposes, not material purposes. So all of that suggests that the concern with death is very ancient.
We can see an example of this in an ancient burial ritual dating back to more than 30 millennia before the building of towns and cities. The dead were decorated with clothing embellished with thousands of ivory beads. Each bead would have taken even the most skilled artisan about an hour to make. That's over 125 days of 24/7 work. This implies the existence of complex hierarchical socio-political organizations almost 30 years before the advent of towns and cities. Another example is Göbekli Tepe, where researchers discovered carved stones weighing more than 20 tons, placed in concentric circles believed to be graves. Mind you, this was thousands of years before humans abandoned their hunter-gatherer ways and developed complex social organizations. Recent theories suggest the construction of temples and ritual sites led to man settling down and building towns in the first place, not the other way around. First came the temple, then came the cities. Klaus Schmidt. While this contradicts the age-old picture of hunter-gatherers roaming the land and eventually accidentally discovering farming and settling down, the sheer amount of human labor that was required to build Göbekli Tepe, as well as the discovery of einkorn wheat, one of the first varieties of domesticated wheat just a short distance away from Göbekli Tepe, upholds this theory of the first societies being built for religious reasons. This is significant because it implies the advent of modern society was built on religion and the fear of death. This knowledge and contemplation about the presence of death can be seen in many other examples throughout history. The Epic of Gilgamesh, the earliest surviving work of literature, is about a man's search for immortality and the subsequent realization that man is destined to be mortal. As for man, his days are numbered. Whatever he might do, it is but wind. We can see the same pondering about mortality in Homer's The Iliad and the Odyssey, immensely elaborate tones of Egyptian pharaohs and Chinese emperors. Renaissance art, mythology, architecture, social organizations, and so much more. The mere knowledge of death has changed the course of human history. But what about today? The world is vastly more secular than it used to be. According to Pew Research, in 41 countries, young adults are less likely to associate with religion than older adults. And according to National Geographic, those same regions have significantly dropped in the amount of people who identify as Christian there. Not to mention the dominance of science and technology in our social structures and culture. But as belief in a spiritual immortality declines, a belief in a new immortality has been born. Recent technologies and organizations have been striving not only to extend human life, but make it indefinite. One of those organizations is right here in Scottsdale, Arizona, Alcor Life Extension Foundation.
How can you cheat death? Death isn't a person.
Chance of this doing us personally any good are probably infinitesimally small. On the other hand, if you're buried, there's zero. And I said, those are my kind of odds.
At no point in time will there be invented a single pill or elixir or medicine that will make the person who takes it functionally immortal.
A former chief operating officer at Alcor says in a new book that William's corpse was mistakenly decapitated and gruesomely mistreated.
Alcor is an organization that provides cryopreservation to people who choose to do that. And our mission is to continually improve our technologies until it is a proven technology and reversible, which it is not now, but to continue to work on making it that, to place people into a suspended animation state, and to keep them safely in that state until revival technologies become available.
Now, wait a second. What is this whole cryopreservation thing anyways? I asked Dr. Ken Hayworth, an ex-Alcor member, neuroscientist, and president of the Brain Preservation Foundation. Quote, cryonics is a proposal that said, hey, if there's some way to stop the decay process of a person that was either terminally ill or recently deceased and store that person for an indefinite amount of time, then maybe that whatever terminal illness, disease they had, could be cured in the far future, and they could be brought back to life. So, that particular idea sounds completely 100% rational. That's a scientific hypothesis right there. Is there a way to preserve somebody using today's technology, whatever today is, so that our future technology can bring them back? So, to me, the question becomes, what techniques are possible for preserving somebody? And traditionally, cryonics said, well, you could use cold temperature because cold temperature works for single cells and other things like that. So why don't we just try cold temperature? And maybe we could try cold temperature with the addition of some cryoprotectant splitting. Now, this cryonics thing sounds like pseudoscience at first, but it is based in science. In fact, we already cryopreserve humans in the form of sperm and egg cells. And according to the National Library of Medicine and National Center for Biotechnology Information, cryonics has been advancing on the front that they've shown that they can cryopreserve rabbit kidneys and rat hippocampi, as well as other things. The way Blake Honiotes, the medical response director at Alcor, described the cryonics process to me was that when one of their members die, they immediately start transport to Alcor facilities, applying various types of medicines and pumping the chest to circulate those medicines. Once at Alcor facilities, they replace the blood with a vitrification solution, which is basically medical-grade antifreeze that freezes the body without causing ice crystal formation, which would destroy all your cells. The theory is then you could then store that person in a tank filled with liquid nitrogen, and in the future bring that person back and cure that person of whatever terminal illness they had. This theory is bonkers to some, but completely reasonable to a lot of other people. A lot of really smart people. One thing that stuck out to me while researching cryonics was how medical technology has completely changed the definition of death. And I don't mean that in a tinfoil hat conspiracy theorist kind of way. I mean the technology used in our hospitals right now. To understand what I mean, we have to understand what it means to be dead, not in a philosophical sense, but a medical one. You might think that death is an on and off switch. You're dead and then you're not. But death is a process, a gradient. Think about it. If you go back 50 years and your heart stopped beating, that's it, you were dead. Now we can bring back people after their heart has stopped. According to Dr. Steffens, even a couple years before we had feeding tubes or mechanical ventilation or heart and lung bypasses, the point at which you would be declared dead moves further and further back. Even now, doctors are redefining the length at which you can bring a dead person back, such as ECMO, or extracorporeal membrane oxygenation, which means oxygenating the blood outside the body, and it can completely replace the function of heart and lungs while a patient waits for transplant. When we say dead, we really mean at a point which medical technology can no longer bring you back. We can see in this graph from Tim Urban, the famous creator of waitbutwhy.com, the gradient of death. As you can see, the end is info death, which cryonicists consider the only true kind of death, which is the point where the brain has been damaged to a point where no information can be recovered from it. But there's a big gap between medical death,
where cryonics starts according to current laws if a do not resuscitate order is given,
and info death. So theoretically, as cryonics says, if you're cryonically preserved at this point, as that line in which medical technology can revive you moves further and further back, with advances in medical technology, you could be revived. Think about it this way. A patient is brought to a typical modern hospital. The patient's heart stopped 15 minutes before EMTs arrived, and he's pronounced immediately dead. Let's call this hospital Hospital A. Well, what if Hospital A learned that Hospital B developed a radical new technology that could revive a patient 60 minutes after cardiac arrest? Well, Hospital A would immediately rush the patient to Hospital B. If Hospital B did save the patient, he technically wouldn't have been dead. What cryonicists suggest that there is a Hospital B that can save the day, except for instead of being in a different place, it's a different time, the future. I think through cryonics we can see this interesting view into death in a modern age, and that it's not binary, but a gradient. And cryonics isn't the only organization that's working towards this goal of human immortality through science. According to Dr. Hayworth, companies like Nectome have been able to successfully preserve an entire human brain with perfect preservation of ion channels and receptor proteins and everything else that's necessary for perfect preservation of the human brain. To quote Dr. Ken Hayworth, "Does the scientific community think that it's that hard to preserve a brain? Because it's not." And according to fightingaging.com, as of 2017, there are currently 10 different anti-aging drug candidates with openly published evidence and more in the pipeline. So obviously this is a direction that medical technology is headed. But should it?
Yeah, sure. Given unlimited resources, unlimited funds to keep frozen bodies frozen for indefinite periods of time, and there's no other more pressing medical issues we need to spend money on than keeping tons of people alive in the hope that there's a cure someday. I mean, fine, like whatever. But I feel like in the real world where we have limited resources that we have to allocate for the most benefit, I have a real hard time with sort of burdening future generations with our popsicle bodies until they figure out how to, like, what's in it for them? Like, I don't get it. Like, I feel like the last thing we still do responsibly for future generations is die and get out of the way. And so this kind of idea that we're going to start filling facilities with our bodies and heads and dump on them the responsibility for bringing us back to life someday is just kind of this really ridiculous arrogance, especially given how badly we're screwing up everything else for future generations.
But others would argue that life extension is the most important issue that we should be focusing on, and that we shouldn't be okay with death.
So, do you think it's worth it? Like, obviously for you, on your end, you pay a couple dollars and then you die, and then, you know, hopefully you wake up in the future. But behind the scenes, there's so much work and time that goes into keeping all these bodies alive. And do you think it's worth it just for a couple of years of afterlife?
Sure I do. Not just myself, not just the freezing of me and my friends, but as something that is available to humanity. I think there's a humanitarian benefit in this as well.
Yeah, like a lot of people are okay with death and dying, and I think like
good for them. That's their business.
Yeah. So like, why aren't you one of those people? Yeah.
To me, that seems like it's why don't you put the gun to your head and commit suicide? Because how do you dare take up space on this earth? So it's a whole different way of thinking. I mean, I will never understand them, why they're okay with death. They will probably never understand me.
Many people that we love are dying, and they don't have time for us to wait. We're not willing to just let them die because it isn't perfected yet. I wasn't willing to tell people that I loved, too bad, you're just going to have to die. There's nothing we can do. And it's because we love people that we don't want to lose them. And that's really the motivation, is to make it possible for people not to have to give up their own life and not to have to give up the lives of people they love. And so for anyone who wants to join our experiment, we're happy to offer them the very best services that we can, rather than just tell them that we're sorry they have to die.
And here's where we get to the heart of the issue. It is a different weighing of the value of life.
Yeah, so like a lot of people say that even if there is like a 0.001% chance of it working, it's still better than being cremated or buried. So what would you say against that argument?
Well, I'd say it's exactly the same as being cremated or buried. And I would again think about like its resources. You can spend your money however you want, but I think I would want to think more carefully about how resources are allocated to the greatest collective benefit than to the tiny chance that something that would benefit me personally as the outcome after I'm dead.
Whether you think that any amount of resources is worth a small percentage chance at extra life, or you think that there are other medical issues that money could be diverted to, it all comes back to death, the meaning of it, and what should be done in a short amount of time before it. Our societies are built on these ideals, whether that be you should go to war, you should praise this God, you should make as much money as possible. In cryonics and modern science, it's live as long as possible. With people like Dr. Michael Hendricks, it's allocate money to the needs of the many rather than the few. It's important to realize that those ideas are coming from the same place, and that's the fear of death.
So how can like being aware of that death anxiety, how can that change us on a personal level and societal level?
Well, at a personal level, it can do a couple of things. I think the main thing it did for me is it helps you understand other people. So there's a lot of people, and this is very true right now in the world, who are very contemptuous of any belief system that they don't buy into. And I think that when you really understand what we've been talking about, which we call terror management theory, you understand that everybody's using a belief system to help cope with their awareness of mortality and their fears of that. And so I think it should make you more compassionate and more tolerant of alternative belief systems. So that's one of the main thing it taught me, is that, look, I may believe this cult is nonsense, or I may not believe in that Jesus was God, but if people do, and that helps them function in the world, that's okay. The only time to be upset about somebody else's belief system is if it prescribes some destructive behavior toward others. So obviously the Nazi worldview is a dangerous one that leads to a lot of harm. But short of something like that, it kind of taught me to be more respectful, that my belief system isn't necessarily more right than anybody else's. Mine works for me, yours works for you, and different people have different ones, cross cultures, within cultures. And it's all serving the same function of helping us feel psychologically secure in the world. And that's a good thing. And so if you have a friend who has a different belief system than you, instead of trying to convince them they're wrong, support it. Just be okay with it. Help them be the best person they can be within the context of their belief system. rather than trying to force them into yours. It's a matter of if your worldview is a one that values tolerance, openness, is not rigid and dogmatic, and you feel like you're contributing within the context of that worldview, then you're likely doing as well with death as one can.
The use of technology to evade death is inevitable. Since the dawn of mankind, humans have used gargantuan amount of resources to evade death, and that's not gonna stop. Whether you think that cryonics has a 0% chance of working and is one of the least effective ways to spend our scarce medical dollars, or you can't possibly comprehend why people aren't clamoring to get themselves a shot at extra life, know that we all fear death. We just deal with that fear in different ways. And the crazy opposing side is feeling the exact same way you are, just a different manifestation. Because in the game of life and death, no one stands taller than the other.